It occurred to me this week and last week that I had poorly planned this section of the series. If I had been smart, I would have scheduled this text for one of the weeks that I had been out of the country and kept something nice and easy like I gave Ray, which was, I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the saints to grasp how high and wide and long and deep is the love of Christ, and to know the love that surpasses all knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. That's a great passage to preach on. Today's text does have something really important to teach us. It's just that what is possibly Paul's most persnickety piece of prose is penned in this particular passage, which poses potential problems for us if we try to precisely parse out the proper point. And saying all that was likely easier than dealing with some parts of this text, which isn't to say that we should just skip over it. Because as tricky as it might be, this is the crescendo of Paul's letter to the Ephesians. This is Paul's, I said all that to say this moment. And our secret weapon in preventing going off track here is something called context. And most of our misapplication of Bible text is a result of picking one or two verses and interpreting them with no consideration of their context. The context they were written in or the context they were written to. There are, I didn't count them myself, but according to Google, there are 31,102 verses in the Bible. And so picking out a single verse or a portion of a single verse and basing our perspective solely on that is kind of like viewing the entire world through a stationary pinhole. Here's an extreme example of what can happen when we start picking out verses of different texts and using them out of the context. The Bible says, Joseph made ready his chariot. Now the flood was on the earth for 40 years, and he sank in his chariot. Joseph called Barsabbas, deliver me out of the mire and let me not sink. The mother of Sisera looked through the window and called through the lattice, why is this chariot so long? And he answered and said unto her, behold the appearance of the wheels. They toil not, neither do they spin. Now, technically, the Bible does say all of that, but we recognize that this story is probably not something we should pay attention to or put much stock into, because it's made up of a bunch of different verses taken out of context, which leaves us with a very different kind of weird version of these phrases than what they were originally meant to tell us. And of course, it's a rather extreme and silly example, but you get the point. So for us to get an accurate sense of what Paul's trying to say here at the end of chapter 5 and going into chapter 6, there are two very important contexts that we need to adequately understand. The first context is the culture of the ancient world that Paul was writing in and the culture of the world that the Ephesians were living in. Here in Canada, it's normal when you're greeting someone to shake their hand, or perhaps if you're really close with the person, you might give them a little hug. If you're guys, you do the side hug. And that's kind of normal here. But other places in the world, a handshake is borderline rude, because in that culture, the common greeting is to kiss someone on the cheek, sometimes 2 or even 3 times. But if I had tried kissing all of you this morning as you came into the building 2 or 3 times each, some of you would have probably started freaking out on me. Some others would have just been highly uncomfortable. There might have ended up being some shoving in fisticuffs with a few of you if that tried to happen. It's funny, as I was reviewing my notes last night, I had the football game going on in the background, and I just happened to be at this part when a bunch of guys came off the field, and one of the guys, the quarterback, started patting them all on the bottom, and I thought, there's another good example. In that context, Apparently okay. Sunday morning at church, probably not go over so well, right? And in a similar way, some of the stuff Paul's going to say here is going to sound a little strange to our ears. And it would be very strange if it was set in 21st century North America. But in first century Roman Empire, it would have sounded very different. What to us sounds very restrictive would have been extremely radical in Paul's day. And we need to read through the lens of that context. Paul's going to address three different people groups in this section: husbands and wives, parents and children, and slaves and masters. But to properly understand what he's saying, we first have to understand what it was like to be a wife or a child or a slave in Paul's day. And I don't want to get bogged down in this too much, and so we're going to paint with fairly broad strokes here this morning. In his morning prayers, a first century Jewish man would give thanks to God that God had not made him a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. Jewish women had very little to no rights and were essentially considered not much more than the property of their husband. The Greek view of women was even lower. Demosthenes stated that the acceptable rule of Greek life was this: we have courtesans for the sake of pleasure, we have concubines for the sake of daily cohabitation, and we have wives for the purpose of having children legitimately and having a faithful guardian for all our household affairs. Xenophon suggests that the ideal station for a wife is that she might see as little as possible, hear as little as possible, and ask as little as possible. And this is a good time to remind you that I'm not saying or endorsing these things. I'm just describing the common worldview at that time. Nobody go running off to my wife afterwards and say, hey, do you know what Mike was saying about you this morning? Please. Roman perspective was even worse when it came to women. Seneca wrote that women are married to be divorced and divorced to be married. He also said that women would date their years not by numbers but by the names of their husbands. Jerome mentions a woman who had been married to her 23rd husband, and she was his 21st wife. Women were, in that time and place, powerless, valueless, exchangeable, disposable. A child's lot was not much better. Under the policy of Patricia Potestas, a Roman father had absolute power over his family. He could sell them off as slaves or make them work in the field, even put them in chains if he so desired. He could punish them as he liked, however severely, even up to and including the death penalty. It was customary for a newborn Roman child, I have a hard time getting through this one. It's customary for a newborn Roman child to be laid at his father's feet. If the father picked it up, that meant he was claiming it. If he turned his back, the child was left and abandoned, usually dying from exposure or being picked up by someone, typically to be raised just long enough to be sold off as a slave. However, the worst lot in the Roman Empire fell to the slaves. In the eyes of the law, they were considered a thing, not a person. Aristotle wrote that a slave is a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate slave. Varro said that the agricultural instruments could be divided into three categories. There are mute instruments, which are like carts and wagons. There are inarticulate instruments, like cattle and oxen. And there are articulate instruments, like slaves. Slaves could be treated and punished literally in any way the master deemed fit or amusing, up to and including torture and death. One Roman writer writes this: "Whatever a master does to a slave, undeservedly, in anger, willingly, unwillingly, in forgetfulness, after careful thought, knowingly, unknowingly, is judgment, justice, and law." And I'm not telling you all that to shock or depress you, only to remind you of the world that Paul lived in, and the world that the people he was writing to lived in. A world and culture that was extremely different than the modern, more egalitarian society that we are living in now, which gives us the proper context to understand what Paul is writing. The other context we need to consider is the context of the letter of Ephesians itself. Our text today does not exist in a void. Paul has been building to this point for 5.5 chapters. He spent the first 3 chapters talking to the Christians in Ephesus about who God is and what God has done for them. And then he shifts gears in chapter 4, and he says, in light of who God is and what God has done, what are you going to do and how are you going to live? And Paul answers his own question, and that answer involves things like walking in unity with other believers and walking in purity in your own life and imitating God and living a life filled with love, following the example of Jesus. All of which comes to a climax in chapter 5, verse 21, when Paul says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." And we like this verse. This is a good verse. This verse echoes the thoughts of Philippians 2, which Robert read for us just a few minutes ago, where Paul says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should not look only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus." And it's not surprising that these 2 passages sound the same, because Paul wrote them at about the same time. The concept of submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ is the linchpin of Paul's message to the Ephesians. As we talked about last week, Paul begins chapter 5 with the instruction to imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are his dearly loved children. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. He loved us, and he offered himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God. And Paul concludes that section by saying, now you need to be smart about it. Don't look to the things of this world to bring you fulfillment. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, because it's only someone who is filled with the Spirit who's able to live out the instruction. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Then Paul says, let me show you what that's supposed to look like. Let me give you a few illustrations of what submitting to one another looks like. And being a good preacher, Paul has 3 points. Each of these points are mere subpoints of verse 21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So what we should really do as we read through this section is start each new paragraph by mentally writing in verse 21, because that's what Paul's thinking as he writes. That's his intent. And nowhere is that more clear than verse 22. And perhaps you figure I'm saying that because both of these verses contain the word submit. But I'm actually saying the exact opposite of that. Because this premise is proven by the fact that both of these verses don't contain the word submit. I don't know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Mike, I think you better get your eyes checked, because I can see it right there in front of me. My notes say black and white, but I'm going to say green and white. And yeah, in English, both verses 21 and 22 have the word submit in them. But in Paul's original letter, that wasn't actually true. Paul's original letter looked something more like this, although more handwritten and less typed. The first word in verse 21, hupotasomenoi, is the word that we are translate as submit in verse 21. But if you look at verse 22, there is no version of hupotasso in verse 22. The literal translation of this text says, submit to one another in reverence of Christ, the wives to their own husbands as to the Lord. Now, our English Bibles borrowed the word submit from verse 21 and put it into 22 just to make it clear what Paul is saying. And I think they're correct in doing that. But I think we would be equally right to borrow the phrase submit to one another and apply it to the start of verse 21 and chapter 6, verse 1, verse 4, and verse 5, and verse 9. You see, the whole point of this entire section is that when people imitate God, when we live a life of love according to Christ's example, when we're not seeking fulfillment from the world, but we're being filled with the Spirit, we will end up submitting to one another. And here's what that can look like. I have two sons, and they are very different. Sometimes, even when I'm asking them to do the exact same task, the instructions I give one are very different from the instructions I give the other. A good example for this is bath time. For one of my sons, when it comes to bath time, I have to specifically say, we need you to go shower right now. And you need to do a good and thorough job of it. And if you don't, here are the consequences. For my other son, I have to specifically say, don't stay in the shower all day long. Make sure you dry off when you get out, and immediately go and get dressed before you do anything else. Now, even though I want my first son to make a shower relatively quick and get dressed immediately afterwards, I don't have to tell him that because he's going to do that anyways. It's the other stuff I have to specifically remind him of. And even though I want my second son not to take forever to get in or to make sure that he gets fully clean before he gets out, I don't have to tell him that because he always does that well anyways. It's the other stuff I have to specifically remind him to do. And the same thing holds true in the examples Paul is using here. And it's most clearly seen in the examples of the parents and the children. We don't expect Paul to say the same thing to both groups because a child's biggest challenge in submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ is going to be very different than a parent's biggest challenge in submitting to one another in reverence to Christ. For that matter, one parent's biggest challenge in submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ could be very different than another parent's biggest challenge. So what Paul is doing here in this text is he's really just kind of picking out what he sees as the most common challenges and saying, for example, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ looks like this. Here are the three relational examples Paul gives. The first one is husbands and wives, and he writes this. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now the church submits to Christ, so wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her to make her holy, cleansing her by washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds it and cares for it just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ in the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he does himself, and the wife must respect her husband. There's been some debate on exactly what the phrase "is the head of" is intended to mean. And the word "submits," especially in this context, carries with it a lot of baggage. But essentially what Paul is saying in verses 22 to 24 is, what I just told everyone to do for one another, wives, do that for your husband. And I think the reason these verses stir up so much resistance from people is because we wrongly associate the concept of mutual submitting with forced submission. God is not advocating any kind of domineering by one spouse over the other. He is not in favor of 50 shades of any color. He would not approve of any relationship where one person demeans or dominates or disparages the other in any way. For husbands, God actually sets the bar much higher, mostly because it had started out so very low. He tells husbands that they should love their wives as they love their own body, as Christ loves the church, so in that way a husband should love his wife. And that's a tall order. A husband ought to care for his wife, be responsible for the well-being of his life, be willing to sacrifice for the good of his wife as Christ has done for the church. And there are a lot of places to get bogged down in this passage. There are more than a few rabbits for us to chase. But thankfully, Paul offers us a concise summary statement in verse 33. He says, however, each one of you husbands must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect the husband. That's what marriage looks like when we're submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ. The second example is parents and children. Paul writes this: submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on earth. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. In this text, most translations will specify fathers, and that's likely an accurate reflection of what Paul was writing at the time. But the word he uses and the principle he uses it for actually fits both mothers and fathers. Paul says, parents, don't be too hard on your kids. Don't be too harsh. Don't be super critical. Don't be overbearing or easily provoked or quick to anger or impossible to please. And Paul highlights this because this was the most common parenting issue, especially for fathers at that time. However, he could have just as easily said, parents, don't be too soft on your kids. Don't spoil them. Don't indulge them. Don't let them get away with anything. Don't make them the ruler of your household. Your number one goal as a parent is to do all you can to bring your children up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Do all you can to teach them to know and love God. And when they are of age, they will make their own choices and their own decisions. But during the formative years, parents are called to put their kids' most important needs above their own wants. Whether what you want is to blow your top or give them a piece of your mind or show them who's boss, or what you want is to be liked, be their friend, or be their hero. For kids, it's pretty straightforward. Honor, obey, and respect your parents. And much like Paul did with wives, he basically says, kids, what I said about submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ, do that with your parents. The final example is masters and slaves. Here's what Paul writes. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever he does, whether he is slave or free. Submit to one another out of reverence of Christ, and masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. First of all, we have to acknowledge that most of us, thankfully, have no context whatsoever to process this example. Most of us have never been slaves, never had slaves, never seen slavery. And secondly, don't overlook how scandalous the line, "Masters, treat your slaves in the same way," is. It would have been borderline obscene for Paul to suggest that the treatment a master receives from a slave is in any way related, let alone the same, as the treatment a master should give to a slave. I've often heard people try and apply this passage to the employer-employee relationship, and on some levels that fits and on some levels it doesn't. But make no mistake, no matter how little you like your boss or how poor of a manager you think he or she is, how little they think of you or how poorly they treat you, it's nothing like what the slaves hearing Paul's letter were dealing with. On the other hand, I think the principles Paul's saying here in these verses do fit the employer-employee relationship, but I think we make a mistake by limiting them to that. Because these principles laid out here apply to any relationship where one person has any kind of authority, power, or influence over another. The boss and the worker, the teacher and the student, the politician and the citizen, the coach and the athlete, or anything else. If you are the one under authority, respect those over you, obey unless it goes against God's law, and work wholeheartedly as if you were working for God. And if you are the one in authority, treat those under you with respect. Value them. Treat them well, because you are submitting to God's authority over you. And it really is as simple as that. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And to be honest, as I was preparing, I felt this feels like an awful lot of setup for a pretty simple point. And in some ways, it is. Because we're so used to getting distracted by a lot of other things when we talk about these topics. Whenever we discuss relationships, there's always baggage and history and emotion and bias and prejudice and precedent. And we're so easily caught up in the he said, she said, they did, I had to. And some of you may be feeling like, well, Mike, why don't you get to the nitty-gritty of these relationships and how they're supposed to work? And there's a time and place for us to do that. But Paul realizes as he's writing this letter, he can't possibly dissect every possible version of every possible scenario. So instead he says, let me just give you one simple rule that will apply to any relationship, any time, any place, any culture. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Or as Jesus would have put it, love your neighbor as yourself. At home, at school, at work, at the mall, in your neighborhood, in your church, in your political discussions, in your friendships. And what I find most interesting about this text is that in these 6 different examples that Paul gives in this passage, although you could infer that Paul is expecting people on both sides of these relationships to be living out this principle, as he gives these specific instructions to each one, his focus is on, here's what you do. Here's how you live. Here's how you submit to others. And you don't do it because the other person has done their part. And you don't do it so that the other person will start doing their part. Repeatedly throughout this passage and the rest of his letter, Paul tells the Ephesians, you live this way not because of anything the other person has, hasn't, or might do. You live this way out of reverence for Christ. You live this way to imitate God and follow the example of Jesus. You live this way in response to who God is and what he has done. Now, Paul is going to talk a little bit about what you do when you're dealing with opposition and antagonism and attack, but not until next week. And so I hope you will join us.